webinar. Perhaps the speakers could just indicate that they are hearing and ready to go. Anya?
Well, Phil, and ready to go.
Well, stay a while. Rhett? Yeah.
Same here.
And Adriana's there. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Joining us for this webinar to mark World Environment Day on the topic of building a biodiverse food system for an inclusive, resilient and safe future. It's an absolute truism to say at the moment that everything we do has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm sure that we're all closeted in different parts of the world to carry on as best as we can in various forms of lockdown and restriction. Many people are taking this opportunity to look towards the future. And I would say it would actually be totally irresponsible for any of us, for all of us, to ignore this challenge and the necessity of not being content to go back to a business as usual life after the COVID-19 pandemic calms down or whatever it will do, but to make sure that we're all reflecting on what we're doing in our jobs and our lives, to make sure that we're adjusting and contributing to a better and more resilient world when we go to our new future, whatever that might be. There are opportunities. There will be trillions of dollars invested in recovery from COVID-19, and that will offer an unprecedented opportunity for a clean, a green, and a just transformation of the global economy, including a transition to a more biodiversity-friendly agriculture and food system, which is the topic of our discussion today. It's going to be important to grasp every opportunity and to shift the post-pandemic world towards towards sustainability and resilience. Amongst these opportunities is the process of renegotiating the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which we'll be talking about a little later. This is currently planning its next phase, which is setting the scene to achieve its targets by 2050. And as we'll be hearing, this presents us with an opportunity, one of the many opportunities we will have to try to shape the world after COVID-19. So in this webinar, we're going to be covering three issues. We'll be talking about the lessons that COVID-19 crisis is teaching us, particularly with respect to the resilience of our current food systems and the role that biodiverse and mixed farming has to play to ensure a sustainable and just transition. We'll be hearing about the science of agricultural biodiversity and the need of moving from agricultural models that are threats to biodiversity to models that contribute to the management of biodiversity. I beg your pardon. And we'll be hearing about the global processes of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and the need for inclusion of agriculture in that convention fully, and a shift in global policies to encourage more diverse agricultural systems that can support a mix of export production and strengthening of domestic production and markets. So those are the areas that we'll be trying to cover. You will have three very distinguished speakers. You'll be hearing from Anya Gassner. She is the Senior Livelihood Specialist and the head of the Research Methods Group at World Agroforestry. You'll be hearing from Rhett Harrison. He's a landscape ecologist and conservation biologist, also at World Agroforestry. And Adriana Vidal, who is a Senior Forest Policy Advisor at IUCN, joining us from Washington, DC. My name is Philip Dovey. I'm a Senior Fellow with World Agroforestry, and my job is quite a simple one. I'll be moderating the discussion. So we'll move pretty well quickly into the first question and the response from Anya. But before I do, please note that we would really like to take questions as this goes on. So if you could use the Zoom chat function, whenever you have a question, we'll try to trawl through them and see how much we can answer towards the end of the session. So in other words, after the presentations, after the discussions, we'll throw the floor open. But at any time, please use the Zoom function, talk to us, and we'll get those questions answered by the the best and most appropriate person on the panel. So Anya, could you kick us off, please? Could you tell us a little bit about the weaknesses that the COVID-19 pandemic is exposing us to in all the sectors of the global economy, really?
Thank you, Phil. Before I actually go into COVID, let me just share my screen. I hope it's going to work. And just talk a little bit about, since we're talking about food system, can you see my screen?
Yep, I can.
Okay. So essentially, before I actually talk about COVID, let me just pause a moment to actually talk about the food system and the agricultural system that we have at the moment. So what we actually have seen since the Second World War is that we have global trade in foodstuff has grown rapidly and changed radically over the recent decades. So if you look at the slides, the biggest change actually has been in the period 1970s to 2000, where we had an increase in gross world food imports, if they're measured in terms of calorie equivalents, by 60%. That's the global numbers. And they were much higher for developing countries. They were 100% for developing countries and about 45% for developed countries. So if you look at the slides, it's from the FAO, what we can see here is that developing countries, or countries in this slide, it's least developed countries, over that period from 1917 to 2000, have essentially from countries that, that depend very strongly on agriculture, whereby agriculture is the backbone of their economy, and it's also the actually backbone of the livelihood and the income of millions of farmers. These countries have become net importers of agricultural products. So that's very important to actually understand for the discussion that we have. And the data is a bit old. It stops in 2000, but the trends has just continued. So our current food system is characterized by being specialized on economics of scale, taking advantage of geographic production advantages, climatic and labor. We have very powerful systems which are very efficient in supplying cereals and meat around the world, and farming systems that have adapted to that to maximize production. These systems usually involve very high levels of specialization, both in terms of the products that we produce, but also the producers. Farmers are very, very specialized people. They're characterized by establishment of large areas of monocultures and intensive livestock production. So that's a system that we were used to and that has become the model before COVID. If I take the next slide. So COVID-19, we have supply chains which are disrupted or delayed. Seasonal migrant workers are not available for harvesting. Farmers are cut off from markets. Urban day laborers have returned to the provinces, to the countryside, and millions are cut off from income and remittance. So what we actually have seen from the COVID crisis is that COVID has exposed the vulnerability of our economy to shock, especially that of the food system. And it has also laid bare the inequality in our systems, because the very essence of cheap food that a lot of us are actually benefiting from is because we have people that produce that food for very little money. So we have especially farmers and migrant workers that live on incomes so close to the poverty line that they and their families did not have the financial buffer to actually survive a crisis like the COVID crisis. And they're the ones that are the hardest hit at the moment. Very much. Seconds. While I'm trying to fix this. Okay, sorry, just got that. So it is a crisis, and it's a crisis we all have to respond to, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for governments to actually invest in diverse farming systems and to shift the model that I just described. So why would actually diverse farming systems be important? Because the food sector, both in cities as well as in rural areas, is one of it's a sector that can respond the quickest to green, new jobs, which are now been looked for by all governments around the globe. Governments are now trying to respond to the COVID crisis by having new businesses and new jobs. So why would we actually do a diverse farming system if we're linking local, regional agriculture production lines with the cities? We will be able to create jobs very quickly. This can only be done by diverse agriculture systems, because if everybody is specialized and all farmers are growing rice, they will not be able to respond to the multiple demands that consumers have in cities. So what's the opportunity here? The opportunity is how one can do this is adding value to local agriculture by moving from production to food businesses. Linking farmers with consumers in urban cities through digitalization, and initiating markets for diverse food baskets through governmental procurement that would initiate the first demand. So we have the government that actually supplies schools, canteen, hospitals. They have an influence here. They could very easily initiate food basket programs that would actually supply these canteens. Thank you, Philip.
Anya, may I come back at you with a couple of supplementary questions?
Sure.
You've made a very strong case for the fact that the current pandemic has exposed a number, in fact, a great number of weaknesses in our global food system. And in particular, it's shown up the vulnerability of agricultural communities, particularly in the developing South. On the other hand, we can argue that the global food system has actually been pretty successful in feeding the world as populations have rocketed. And we're expecting something like 9 billion people in the world by 2050. And so far, production of food around the world has pretty well kept up with the increase in population. It hasn't eliminated hunger by any means, which is a huge issue, but we've pretty well kept up with production. And in many ways, this is typified by a system where food is produced intensively. I think Rhett is going to be saying a little bit about this in the future, and it's moved around the world large distances, and it's had the effect of providing pretty cheap food for most people around the world. Similarly, developing countries have invested in their own intensive production, very often very often commodities such as oil palm, cocoa, and things like that. And they've earned quite a lot of foreign exchange by exporting those products. Where do you see this? Do you see this disappearing in the future? Do you see a total shift towards local production, or what should we be aiming for? Can you give some insight?
Thanks, Philip. No, I think thanks for the question. I might have sounded a little bit anti-globalization at the moment, but that's not really what it is. I mean, globalization, as I've pointed it out, it's been a major success after the Second World War to actually fuel a growing population. It has also brought down food prices, and it's been a very effective and efficient system. However, it's also been shown that while we have increased productivity, we actually have a very unproductive food system. We have huge food waste. We have diets which are unhealthy because of the specialization of agriculture and the products that comes with it. And even before COVID, there have been a lot of voices that actually been raising that problem that the system we're having is unsustainable. You just actually mentioned, and I think Rhett will be talking about this a little bit more, so I'm not going into the environmental effects of specialized conventional agriculture. And I think Adriana might be touching on that too. But you were actually talking about cheap food. Now, cheap food is a relative term because our current model is based on that inputs that come from nature, water, clean air, is actually for free. So there is no proper accounting done of the environmental or the health costs. We just talked about diets that come with a very specialized, monotonous food system and an agriculture system. If these costs would actually be accounted for, then the idea of cheap food would pretty quickly actually turn out to be a myth. I am not against globalization, definitely not, and I don't think anybody of us here is. But what we're saying is it needs to be balanced. We're seeing, like a crisis like COVID has seen, that if we have a system where we almost exploit producers to produce for such a low income, so we can have cheap food prices, that these people are very, very vulnerable, as I just explained it, when these value chains are actually disrupted. Also, side effect of globalized agriculture is because the conventional agriculture by now has benefited from green revolution. I mean, it's a very fantastic intervention that's been hugely successful, but it's been favoring a certain system of agriculture. We're leaving diverse system out. If we had the same inputs in local value chain, so what we're actually looking for is the green revolution for diverse local agriculture. And what we need to look at is a balanced system whereby farmers and rural economies can benefit both from global value chains, but also from the demands that their own urban centers are having.
Thanks, Rem. Thank you very much. I think that sums it up beautifully at the end. And it gives us a nice segue into what I think we're going to be hearing from Rhett. Rhett, can you tell us a bit more about the changes we might like to see in our production systems and how they relate to the things we've been talking about, sustainability and biodiversity? In fact, what is agricultural biodiversity? Can you tell us why it's so important? Are you there, Rhett?
Muted. Thank you. Okay. Yes. All right. Thank you for the question, Phil. Yeah, so I was going to answer the last question first. What is agricultural biodiversity? So in general, biodiversity is essentially the all of nature that's out there. And in this case, obviously in our agricultural land. So that includes all the crop species and the varieties of those crops and also their genetic diversity, which enables them to survive across a range of agricultural environments, such as environments with more or less rainfall. It also includes all the animals in the soil that support the soil production and nutrient cycling and so forth. It includes the pollinators and the pest controls and the pests themselves. And of course, it includes the biodiversity that we see around our fields, the birds and so forth, and the trees and natural environments that abut to our fields. Some of that, of course, some of that agricultural biodiversity we are using to produce food, and some of it is providing services for food production, such as pollinators. But other agricultural biodiversity is just living there in the same space, sharing the environment with our food production systems. Now, if we want to talk about the changes that we might want to see, as has already been mentioned, when we look at a modern agricultural landscape, and this of course is not everywhere, but it is the predominant model. What we see is huge areas cultivated under a single crop, vast areas of monocrop. We see that the soils there are doused with liberal quantities of industrial produced fertilizers, and the crops themselves are sprayed with poisonous chemicals often every few weeks to control for weeds and pests. And this is not a sustainable form of agriculture. The increasing areas of land in the world are becoming degraded. About 20% of the world's agricultural land is already degraded, and in Africa it's near 40%. And primarily around that is soil degradation from depleted nutrient status of the soils. And we can also look at it from a pest control point of view. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, was published in 1962. Yet between 1970 and 1995, the cost of pesticide use in the US increased by 15% year on year because of things like pest resistance, and so forth. There was greater and greater demand for pesticides, so the costs went up. And when we see how soils are used, in this sort of modern industrial form of agriculture, soils are often treated simply as a medium for roots to grow in, rather than a habitat, which includes natural enemies and all sorts of other organisms in it. So, as we've already discussed, this system has put cheap food on the shelf, but this food is really only cheap because we have not factored in the externalities. We haven't factored in the long-term environmental damage that this farming system is having in many parts of the world. We also haven't factored in things like the consequences for human health. The other thing to be aware of course, is that this system is heavily subsidized by governments. Almost every government in the world has some kind of farm subsidy program. And in many cases, huge sums of money are spent to prop up this industrial model. And it has been found in several studies that smallholder mixed farming systems are often more productive and economically efficient in the absence of subsidies and other market distortions. So to put agriculture back on its sustainable path, we need to be focusing on how we can manage this agricultural land in a way that enhances biodiversity and the ecosystem services that this biodiversity underpins. So it needs to be recognized that the biodiversity not only supports food production, but it can also secure water supplies, sequester carbon in soils and biomass, and thereby mitigate global climate change. And it can establish a food production system that is more resilient to shocks, whether those be economic shocks, something like the COVID-19 that we're currently experiencing, or also shocks like droughts or floods and other such disturbance. Healthy soils recycle nutrients and enhance plant resistance to disease. Uncultivated land around fields provide habitat for natural enemies, while wildflowers provide food for pollinators. Trees, hedgerows provide habitat for birds and bats, which also feed on crop pests. And forests and other natural habitats protect ecosystem services such as water supply for irrigation. And it's also been shown many times that distance from forest or other quality habitat is a key determining factor in the pollination or pest control services that nature provides. So the other thing that we need to point out is that well appropriately managed agricultural land can also provide essential habitat for wild species. These are species that are just living there and are not in any direct way benefiting the food production system. But and these species include species that favor open habitats, but are increasingly rare today in many countries. And they also include species that may live in forests, but need to use agricultural land to move between forest fragments. The sort of standard conservation modus operandi up until now has been to focus on protected areas. And of course, protected areas are important, but many reserves are too small or isolated to support wild populations on their own. They need to connect with habitat outside protected areas. And therefore, if we're going to conserve these species, we need better management of mosaic landscapes to enable species to move between patches of natural habitat. So back to you, Phil.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Rhett. And I think you made a number of very important points. I'll just pick up on basically the last two that you made, that not only were you very eloquent in explaining how proper management of biodiversity in agricultural lands can benefit agriculture in the various ways you mean, but also that agriculture can become one of the tools that we have in managing biodiversity overall. And that whereas we're very, very conscious of the very reasonable accusation that that agriculture is an enemy of biodiversity. I think you put it on the table quite clearly that agriculture can be a means of conserving biodiversity as well, to the benefit of the wild biodiversity which can use agricultural landscapes. Now, thank you very much for that very clear explanation. I think we'll hear from Adriana fairly soon that that is not necessarily a position which is held by everybody. And we have some interesting discussions to be had. So Adriana, as we know, before this global pandemic, there was an important political debate going on, and that was how to address biodiversity in agriculture as part of the process to develop the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework at the CBD, that is the Conventional Biological Diversity. You'll tell us very briefly that this is an important process which is setting the global agenda for biodiversity up to 2050. Could you tell us a little bit about what the different perspectives that have been expressed, so what are the different perspectives that have been expressed so far? And perhaps you can give us some pointers towards where negotiations are heading and the opportunity that a response to the pandemic could generate. If you could give us some background, that would be very, very interesting indeed. Thank you, Adriana.
Great. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, everybody. Let me share one slide so people can follow the key messages that I want to share. Let's see, hopefully this works. Okay. Are you seeing this? The
Yes,
slide?
Yep.
Okay, great. Let me see. Let me know if it changes for some reason. Thanks. Okay, so to your question, Phil, yes, indeed, there is a political opportunity to shift the post-pandemic world towards sustainability and resilience through the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework under the CBD. But first, let me give you some background information about where we are at with the current Ihe Biodiversity Targets, which are the global biodiversity targets that countries have committed to. Land conversion for agriculture and livestock production is indeed one of the biggest drivers for natural ecosystems and biodiversity loss. And the international response has been concentrated in the promotion and the protection of natural ecosystems as a way to prevent further expansion of agriculture. In this line, agriculture is dealt under the current Ihe Biodiversity Targets as a productive sector where sustainable practices need to be expanded, assuming that sustainable use and biodiversity conservation are inherently linked. However, there is one key perspective that hasn't been stressed enough in countries' efforts to protect biodiversity, which is the importance of mixed, diverse agricultural landscapes for their contribution to the conservation of wild biodiversity. And these points have been made before by Rath and Anja. Now, to where we are at, the CBD has an opportunity to bring its influence to bear on international policy, positioning agricultural lands and other managed ecosystems' contribution to sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity in three distinctive ways. First, as an agricultural ecosystems as habitat for species used by humans, or called agrobiodiversity, including agricultural species and beneficial species to support food production. The second is agricultural ecosystems as habitat for wild biodiversity for those species that use agricultural landscapes to fulfill all or part of their niche requirements, as well as strictly forest-dwelling species that use the agricultural matrix to disperse between forest fragments. And thirdly, as a source of ecosystem services that support human health, food security, climate change mitigation, and adaptation responses and water supply. Particularly in the draft text of the post-2020 biodiversity framework, parties should consider three key points to achieve a holistic treatment of agricultural lands, both as habitat in benefit of biodiversity and humans. First, avoid restricting the global goals pursuing conservation to only natural ecosystems. Several conservation measures can also be taken in managed ecosystems that will impact the survival of both domesticated and wild species and will support natural ecosystems as well. Second, recognize the landscape approach as the best way to manage biodiversity. This includes both natural ecosystems, which must be protected, but also multi-use mosaic ecosystems that blend many forms of productive use with conservation, include agriculture, woodland, grassland, water bodies, and wilderness. Agricultural land within these landscapes should be managed in a manner that optimizes biodiversity conservation and links protected areas to permit the movement of species. The landscape approach principles, by the way, encompass a much broader set of objectives than the phrase spatial planning, which has been included in the draft Goal A and Target 1 of the current draft of the framework. And the third proposal is to explicitly recognize in the existing proposed Target 8 the connection between agricultural landscapes and biodiversity, not only for food production or for agrobiodiversity, but also as a habitat of wild species where agricultural landscapes provide connectivity functions in support of natural ecosystems. If this is recognized, then a door opens for countries to focus on measures and policies that ensure that farming systems are more biodiversity friendly and sustain the full breadth of species that depend on agricultural landscapes. One final key message I wanted to share is that at the country level, countries have the opportunity to marshal a transformative shift from policies that favor mostly simplified, monocultural, conventional agriculture to policies and measures that incentivizes job creation in the COVID aftermath, while promoting actively biodiversity-friendly mixed farming at a landscape and large scale. These systems allow for improved soil biodiversity, pest disease control, and other benefits, and involves the incorporation of wild trees and shrubs, the maintenance of uncultivated lands and niches, establishment of biodiversity corridors, etc. All of these can generate a sustained source of jobs, transform food production, and support biodiversity. I'll stop there and be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, I've lost sight of my screen, so I can't tell if I'm muted, but I think I am unmuted. Could someone confirm that, please?
You're okay, Phil.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, I've got my screen back now. I can see what's happening. Thank you very much indeed, Adriana. You've made it, that was a very comprehensive case for the importance of including agricultural biodiversity into the negotiations. Can I ask you a question? Without pointing fingers at particular delegations or anything like that, how do you see the polarization going on in the negotiations for the next round of the CBD in terms of where there is opposition to including agricultural biodiversity in the global framework which is being negotiated? What's underpinning this, do you think? What's the impression you get from your experience of attending meetings?
So just to clarify, it's not that there is agriculture is indeed one of the productive sectors dealt with under the CBD. It is absolutely critical to address how the production systems exist and evolve. And the perspective at the CBD has been to promote sustainable agriculture as a way to achieve conservation. However, as I said before, there is critical nuances between sustainable agriculture and actual biodiversity conservation. And I think that part has been a bit, perhaps it hasn't received the focus it should be from my observation. And I can't generalize, of course, but I understand that countries are really rooting for conservation efforts in areas where there is a high biodiversity, score or levels, such as key biodiversity areas, protected areas, and areas that you basically cannot afford to lose. Therefore, when you use the phrase or the word conservation, you usually delegates and countries, and actually the Aichi targets themselves point to those type of ecosystems. So now in the post-2020 biodiversity framework, where everything is up to discussion, it is logical that countries bring these concepts to the table again. However, I am hopeful that these different perspectives about how to integrate the agriculture sector and agricultural landscapes to promote biodiversity conservation is evolving. Just by looking at the last conversations that happened in March in Rome, where several parties have mentioned that the goals for conservation and net loss principles should apply to all ecosystems, not only to natural ecosystems, but also ecosystems across the board. So measures are consistent and holistic in that way. Of course, nothing is decided yet. Conversations and negotiations still need to happen. But I think there are important signals to be seen, and basically everybody who participates in the CBD process has the opportunity to support this more comprehensive approach to agriculture.
Okay, thank you very much. And that's quite encouraging in many ways. I think what you're saying is, though, I think many of us observed in the early stages of the negotiation some quite strongly expressed opinions that the convention should really be focusing on protected areas and not necessarily productive landscapes. But as you're pointing out, this debate is going on and different voices are coming in, and the broader concepts of looking at biodiversity in productive landscapes and all landscapes is being discussed quite actively. So we certainly need the help of everybody who has influence with the delegates to this convention to make sure that dialogue continues and that we get the full recognition of agricultural landscapes in the convention. If I can just abuse my position as the moderator, I think I'd point out that this is rather important, because although maybe the convention seems a little bit of a niche convention to some people, it does actually establish very important principles of global policy. And those global policies will affect the way that land is used around the world, and it will affect where investment goes in different places. So we do have an important discussion here, and thank you for giving us such a detailed explanation of what is going on. If we could start taking, I'm getting a few questions coming through. So if you'll forgive me referring to my second device, quite a few people have made comments which I think are important. And if they'll forgive me, I'll not acknowledge every single person, because there's quite a few of them talking about the opportunities for improving nutrition. Anya commented, I think, in her discussion earlier on, that we are one of the disadvantages of our current food system is that it is supporting very unhealthy diets. And we've had several comments coming in, which I think are implying that we need to say and recognize much more the importance of the post-COVID situation, focusing on nutrition when we're focusing on the food system. And we've had comments talking about nutrition basically as well, talking about nutrition in general, and also the impact that it will have on chronic degenerative diseases. So I think has been very helpful from the comments we've got from the audience, focusing on the nutrition aspect. Peter Goebbels, I don't have any accents on this, so I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name properly. But he asked the question, which I'm going to, I think I'll refer to Anya. And the question is, will more localized food systems not lead to increased food prices for poorer citizens?
Thank you, thank you, Peter, and thanks, Phil, for passing the question on. Well, Peter, I think it's all a question. There are two parts of it. Number one, cheap food is relative. I'm German. I was in Germany just over Christmas and had the usual conversation with my mother because I went and bought a fair trade coffee. And when I do that, it usually actually gets into the same discussion with my mom, who is retired and single, and would say, well, look, not everybody can have fair trade coffee, because if the prices would be like fair trade, then she, as a retired person, would not be able to afford and enjoy coffee anymore. My argument to her is like, look, the coffee you're buying is not cheap. Somebody else is paying the price. And that is usually the farmer in a producer country. So if you talk about for whom it is cheap, we just actually, earlier in my slides, I was talking about who are the most vulnerable people in a global crisis like COVID. It is the farmers, it is the migrant workers that basically are the ones that give their labor for very cheap, for those very cheap food prices. That's one part of the story. The other part of the story, I don't know where you're from, Peter. So as I said, I'm German. In the EU in 2015, the numbers in Britain were to keep a hectare of cropland in cultivation was costing £700. So the EU is subsidizing extremely heavily the production of agriculture as we know it to keep the prices low. So to me, the question is not really whether a shift in the food system will actually result in an increase in food prices. The question is, how do we set the policy instruments and the incentives at the right angle to ensure that it's fair for everybody?
Thank you very much indeed, Anya. We've got a few questions which are all going in the same direction, so I'll try to combine them. Ramni Jamnadas says we also need to invest in increased productivity and quality of local crops that can be planted, and she's pointing out that there's been very little investment in anything but the world's top 10 crops. Almost everything we invest in comes down to about 10 species at the end of the day. Alexis's iPhone has asked us what opportunities or alternatives exist for increasing yields and keeping productivity sustainable. In other words, all right, we're talking about increasing yields, we're talking about doing it through some form of eco-agriculture, but what are the alternatives? And Peter again, no, let's just leave it at that. So really the question is, and I think I'll throw this to Anya and to Rhett to make any comments that they want. Okay, we've been talking about it. We know that we have to increase yields locally. What are the opportunities? What are the options? What should we be doing differently?
Who's going
Rhett,
first?
do you want to start?
Okay. Yeah. First of all, I think it's important to point out that there's a myth out there that this industrial approach to agriculture is always more efficient, and if you go to mixed farming systems, you become less efficient. Of course, it exists in some places, and and sometimes, but mixed farming systems are often very efficient. And in fact, there is I see that somebody else was asking about point to studies that show that mixed farming systems are more productive. Well, there's a very good FAO study on that topic, which found that globally smallholder systems were more productive than large-scale farming systems. So there is good science out there showing that at least in some places, smallholder systems, mixed farming systems are actually more efficient. And then another problem with the myth that's out there is that it's based on a situation where people are not considering these externalities. I mean, there's a lot of greenhouse gas produced in the industrial production of fertilizer. And then when fertilizer is put on fields, you've then got nitrous oxide production as well. So using locally a mixed farming system in which you're producing manure and crop biomass that's being recycled to fertilize your field substantially cuts down on those externalities. I think the other thing is that is this question of investment, which Ramni also mentioned. I'm staying here in Zambia. If we look at 40 years of history of Zambia, of the farming in Zambia, 40 years ago, farmers in Zambia were very diverse. They produced a whole range of crops on small plots. But the system here, the subsidy system that the government has been running for these past decades, focuses on maize. And what has happened is because of this focus on subsidizing inputs to maize and then also guaranteeing maize prices, you've had a massive reduction in the diversity of smallholder production in Zambia over those 40 years. And the results are terrible, because not only are we seeing a very farming system now that is very prone to shocks and so forth. You get a drought in one area and a whole section of the country no longer has sufficient food to feed itself, and they depend on donors to provide handouts. So not only is it a very vulnerable system, but we are also seeing Zambia is actually a relatively wealthy country in sub-Saharan Africa, and yet it has one of the highest rates of stunting in sub-Saharan Africa because of the extremely poor diet, which has been driven by this focus on maize. So I think that it's important that we have to have a holistic view of the problem. But it is also important to recognize where and when mixed farming systems can be more productive, or at least as productive. They're often more cost efficient. Being more productive is not always the case. But there are ways. I mean, when we talk about going into mixed farming systems, we're not saying we should roll the clock back 60 years. What we're saying is we should use modern agricultural science, agroecological approaches, including things like fertilizer trees, careful recycling of biomass and manure, and other such technologies to support, and combined with things like improved varieties of many of the crop plants that we're growing, to have efficient production systems.
Thanks very much, Rhett. Thanks particularly for sort of exploding the myth that small-scale mixed farming is not productive. I think that was a very important message indeed. Thank you for it. Do you want to add anything, Anya?
Very quickly, I mean, what makes systems productive is, on the one hand, is that you have to have good germplasm. You need to have good seed and seedling systems to make them productive. And the rest, of course, is water and nutrient and sun. So we already talked for quite some time about if you mix the components up, they can actually support each other with water and nutrients. So you don't need to have fertilizers necessarily to the same amount that monocrops need. But where I think where Ramni's question came in, where we actually do have an issue in the smallholder sector, is that we talked about this. We had 50 years of an incredible, effective system of agriculture research together with extension people working on about 10 crops to actually optimize the germplasm of that crop. So we didn't have that for the mixed systems, and that's what we're saying. We're saying, that's what we need. We need that research, we need that investment into germplasm of these crops. And if you do, you make the system automatically more productive.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed for that very important point. I think there's a lot of questions coming in, and we're going to have to apologise in advance for not being able to handle all of them. But I've got two for Adriana, if I may, Adriana. Marcelo Ignacio Becuna has asked the question. It's a fairly factual question. What is the role of indigenous peoples in conserving agrobiodiversity, and how is the CBD taking it up?
Okay. Thank you for the question. Indeed, indigenous peoples, local communities are prominently featured in the current post-2020 biodiversity framework conversations. Actually, the fifth and last proposed goal of the proposed post-2020 biodiversity framework focuses on benefit sharing, of genetic resources and others in favor of indigenous peoples and local communities. And specifically, I think that there are three ways that indigenous peoples are, I guess, covered or addressed on indigenous peoples' rights. First is, of course, as I just said, the benefit sharing of all of the benefits coming from natural ecosystems where indigenous peoples live, and they protect these sources. Second, protection for indigenous people's rights to use wild species for their own lives and livelihoods, and also participation of indigenous peoples in sustainable, not participation, but actually receiving guidance and taking advantage of the traditional knowledge generated by indigenous people to promote and sustainable use of ecosystems. And that includes agricultural ecosystems as well.
Okay, thanks very much. I've got another question directly to you, Adriana. I think I'll combine it with, it's from Peter again, but I'll combine it with one from Michel Duham. What Peter is asking is, Adriana, can you, what has to be done to promote agriculture, agroecology in a landscape approach? You know, how do you practically arrive at a landscape approach? Is it planned at the district level, at the community level? What kind of planning, or is it something else? He's just asking for some guidance of how to do it. And Michelle has also asked a question relating to what programs and incentives currently exist to promote the integration of biodiversity into agricultural systems. Can you give us some insights in basically when this is CBD policy, what are the programs going to look like? What are we going to have to do?
Wow, those are very large questions. I'll try to address some of the items that you mentioned, but please, Anja, feel free to complement. Regarding the landscape approach, yes, so the landscape is not defined necessarily by the limits of a district or the limits of a province or a jurisdiction established by the government. Actually, it is established by the users and the decision makers with regards of the needs and priorities to manage a specific area. This area could be set out by the natural limits, I don't know, rivers, mountains, existence of protected areas. I mean, it's very dynamic. There is no book definition of a landscape necessarily. I think it is decided on the ground, but the main point is that when you want to use the landscape approach, the idea is that you take into consideration all land uses that exist in this particular area and try to balance out the different priorities for this landscape in order to maintain ecosystem integrity and at the same time to respond to population needs. And that is what's the contribution of the landscape approach. So instead of focusing on, let's say, plantations or crops, and focus on incentivizing the production of this area, and only that, the landscape approach looks at what are the consequences of doing that for water availability, or for natural areas that could be in the vicinity that could be impacted by these actions. So it's basically looking at all the factors that could be in place when you implement these land management decisions. And there are certain principles, of course, of the landscape approaches that we'll be happy to share for people to read on. And the next question, can you remind me about the second question, please?
No, I think you've covered it, because the second question was really, bear with me. I think the second question was, what are the incentives to do this? And I think you've covered that in many ways.
Okay. Well, there are, at least from the perspective I'm covering in this webinar, which is the CBD and these official bodies and the processes, there are several programs that incentivize the protection of, the sustainable agricultural or agrobiodiversity in countries. Not, as I was explaining before, from the perspective of enhancing food systems, making them more diverse, ensuring sustainable crop production, sustainable practices, etc. There is also a big focus on pollinators, where there is a promotion of certain types of activities on the ground in order to protect wild and domesticated pollinators. But you are more than welcome to visit information on the website at the CBD. There are programs promoted by FAO and implemented in countries, international initiatives, and so on. But yeah, it will be interesting to see in the future how these initiatives also encompass this perspective that we have been discussing, which is our agricultural ecosystems for conservation of biodiversity.
Okay, thanks very much. And again, if I may just add something, I think there are some genuine obstacles. I have a large amount of development background in my career, and I've always been very struck by the fact that the development community tends to work within administrative boundaries, even when they have what they call area-based development, which basically is integrated development across all sectors. They tend to do it within within administrative boundaries with local authorities, whatever it might be. When you're taking a landscape approach, you very often have to work across administrative boundaries, because the landscapes cross over to, from one local government to another, and you have to have negotiations and agreements across there, which some of us as ecologists might not be quite comfortable in doing. I think the point I'm making is that when we go into landscape management, there is a political element to it. There's a very important political element to it. Having said that, it's by no means impossible, because we've been doing this with the river basin authorities for decades. River basin authorities are a very good example of a landscape that transcends administrative boundaries. And we've sometimes, if you look at the establishment of river basin authorities, I would guess that about 60% of the effort goes into the negotiation of the bounds of the authority across different authorities, and rather less of it into the actual practice of managing the basin. That's just a passing observation. I think we can move on and take a few more questions. In fact, following on to that, Arvin Lopez has asked can you provide examples of countries or localities actually practicing the landscape approach? What barriers and lessons have been learned? I can come in with this. Rhett, from your ecologist point of view, can you tell me what you've seen happening?
How would I say? It can be interpreted by different people in different ways. In many ways, actually, the landscape approach, as it being defined as a landscape approach, comes from the conservation fraternity. And it came when conservationists started to understand that they couldn't just look at their protected area, and they needed to look at the pressures outside protected areas, and therefore the landscape approach. But yeah, people have been managing landscapes obviously for a long time, local, district governments and so forth are often the most important of the institutional players in such at such a scale. But all sorts of efforts can be considered. I mean, it's very famous how various city governments, for example, have focused on restoring tree cover in landscapes in order to guarantee water supplies for the urban population. And then there are other examples of food production in the peri-urban and just the rural areas close to cities, where again there's been a focus by city governments to encourage that kind of economic activity. And in Europe now and in America, these processes are often supported by consumer groups who wish to buy local. They go to local produce markets and so forth. So yeah, the landscape approach has been in various forms, has been practiced in many different places. I think the critical thing as we understand the landscape approach nowadays is that it is it's an approach in which you need to gather different institutional stakeholders together. It's often multi-sectorial, so you're not just looking to the Ministry of Agriculture, but also to those concerned with environmental protection and forestry and so on, and also things like urban management. And then you're also looking at, of course, the different stakeholders in the landscapes, because particularly in the developing world, there are a large population of people who are making their livelihoods within these landscapes, and their interests need to be taken care of. So I think the landscape approach, it's been applied in different contexts, around the world, and there are plenty of examples out there. But the critical about it is that it is, cross-sectorial, multi-institutional, and very much tries to focus on addressing through negotiation the concerns of very different stakeholders. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And if the questioner would like to send us her email address, we can send you some references to surveys of landscape approaches which have been carried out. They're a few years old now, but they'll be fairly indicative of what's going on. Right, just to show we don't only take easy questions, I think this one should be addressed to our non-existent economist. So I'm going to give it to you, Anya, if that's okay. But it's from Peter DeLange, and he says, one assumption of the recommendations, I'll start again. One assumption of the recommendations seems to be that workforce is readily available, and possibly due to COVID, and we have an opportunity to use job creation as an argument for switching to biodiverse systems, which are more labor intense. That's the statement that's been made. Where I live, Romania, this is not our reality, and labor is hard to find. Do you have any advice on how we could move to a biodiverse agriculture in this context? I think the core of the question is biodiverse agriculture more labor intensive? And how do we move in that direction?
Thank you. Peter, so there are two parts. So you're sitting in Romania. Why don't you have people in Romania that actually can work on the fields? I think because a lot of them are currently in Germany and the Netherlands and working for very cheap labor in the meat production areas, which we've just been in the news under the COVID crisis over the last 3 weeks. So the point of labor is we will have labor if the income and the incentives are right, people will actually do the work. If, of course, farming doesn't make any money, then nobody's going to do it and people will go to the cities. So that was my whole point earlier, that it is not about just keeping people on the countryside and keeping them on the field as farmers. The investment has to come into farmer cooperatives and moving farmers from pure producers up the value chain to actually small, medium enterprises. Only actually if there is a decent living to be made from agriculture, then we would see people actually be working there. Coming to the question if more diverse systems are more labor intensive, yes, I think so, obviously, because the more diverse the system is, it's harder to actually automated use machineries. That's why we have in the north of Germany, we will have seen large fields with no more trees because it's very difficult to get your tractor around the tree. So you better take the tree out. So of course, if we keep the trees in, if it's more integrated, it is more labor intensive. But also to the question of like labor. So I'm sitting in Manila in the Philippines, and we definitely have a surplus of labor. And what we have seen here in Manila during the lockdown, and I know that's true for India as well, and it might be true for a lot of other countries, that the day laborers, which are you urban poor, they have actually left the city before the lockdowns, if that was still possible, and went back to the provinces. So there is this opportunity of actually, if governments are willing to invest in the agricultural sector. And when we say that, it is not just the farming system, but it's also the supporting mechanism to actually make it into an agribusiness, then people actually would have labor in the rural areas. So I don't think the trend would reverse. If the economy comes back, the question is, where do you want the economy? Do you want them in these like million cities of Asia where everybody goes to a city because they can't make a living on the countryside? Or do we actually want to think about how do we decentralize our economy and keep people in a more healthy and secure environment?
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks, Annie. We've gone over our hour, so I think I'm suggesting that we close it with one question, with huge apologies to the many people who sent in questions and comments that we've not been able to get to. But this is a rather important thing in global policy terms. It's from Jan Dash, and it's, can you comment on the importance of biodiversity in agriculture to climate change mitigation? Rhett, I think this comes back to you.
Yes, sure. So yes, this kind of one of the key points about going into these more diverse agricultural systems is, in fact, the climate mitigation potential. So the experts argue as to the exact amount, but there is no doubt that there is considerable scope for locking up more carbon in agricultural soils than currently exists because of the current practices. So, well-managed agricultural soils store quite large amounts of carbon in the soil. And so that's one way in which agriculture can contribute directly to carbon mitigation. And then the other main area is the above ground biomass, the biomass of vegetation in particular, well, essentially in vegetation, because we're not expecting huge herds of herbivores to be on agricultural land. But yeah, again, agricultural systems with more trees in them are, they're more biodiverse, especially if those trees come from a diverse number of species, and they lock up a lot more carbon. And it's quite a big difference. I mean, the types of in Zambia, where actually the trees are not that big, but you have quite a lot of them in agricultural land, the amounts of the biomass that you get in agricultural land is equivalent to some types of forest in the northern hemisphere. So the potential to lock up carbon in trees in agricultural land is very high. And I wanted to speak as well to a couple of suggestions about labor and the productivity. For example, if we take a silvopastoral system, silvopasture is where you combine trees with pasture systems for cattle or other grazing animals. And for example, with cattle, it's been shown that you get about a 30% increase in productivity just by having places where cows can seek shade in the heat of the day, and also from the fertility of the grass, because the trees draw up nutrients from deeper down in the soils, which the leaves then get scattered on the grass and so forth. So a field with about a 10 to 15% canopy cover of trees produces about a 30% increase in dairy production or in meat production. And then looking at a completely different system here in Africa, one of the big problems is wood fuel. So a lot of labor goes into the collection of wood fuel, and sometimes, particularly women, have to walk very large distances every day to collect wood fuel. So on farm production of wood fuel through growing trees saves a lot of labor by having by cutting down on the labor required to go and get those resources from further away. So I think in response to some of the questions, these mixed farming systems are not they don't answer all the productivity questions in every situation, but there are many situations in which mixed and more diverse agricultural systems are more productive and can contribute to labor saving. They don't have to require more labor.
Thank you for wrapping that up so effectively, Rhett. Excellent. I think all I have to do is to thank everybody for their time and their interest over the last hour plus. I'd like to thank our three speakers. I'd like to say a quick word of thanks to the team at World Agroforestry, which has been behind the scenes and making sure this has worked. And from where I sit, it has worked seamlessly. So I'm always nervous of these things, but it's gone very well indeed. So thanks to everyone, but particularly to the 120 so people who joined us. I repeat my apologies that we couldn't get to every question. Perhaps we'll have a discussion amongst us how we can deal with leftover questions. We'll talk about it later. But at this stage, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope that we've launched some interest, which will get a little bit of head of steam up. We're aiming towards a more sustainable agricultural future when we emerge from the lockdowns that we're in at the moment. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay interested. Goodbye.
Thanks. Good night. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.